Hi everyone, my name is Carmen, and today I want to talk to you about design systems and give you an 8-step guide to building a robust design system foundation that will set your design system for success at its later stages. So I'm a UX designer for Fruto, a UX design studio based in Oxford. We work with various sectors and we have a strong track record working for healthcare, education, and nonprofit organizations. We work with global organizations through to early stage startups. And in my time at Fruto, I've got the opportunity to lead the upskilling of teams in UI design. I've worked with the government's digital design service, and I've helped teams set up the foundations of their design systems. So at Fruto, one of our superpowers is to embed ourselves within other teams and become an extension of that team. That requires us to adapt to those teams and understand them well. As part of that, I often sit with designers and developers to understand the starting point for us. And I often find that many terminologies come up and that there are different understandings of what elements form a design system and the role those elements play. So I thought a good way to start today is by glossing over the confusion and getting on the same page about what exactly makes a design system. So when talking about design systems, these are some of the terms that come up often. Style guide, design tokens, UI kit, component library, pattern library, design principles, guidelines, reference site. Feeling overwhelmed yet? Okay, so let's have a look at what these elements are and how they work together. So a style guide is closely related to the brand guidelines. The style guide of a design system includes information and rules related to colors, typography, icon style, spacing, etc., and directions on how to use these elements. It influences the style of all components and patterns, defining how the whole interface should look and feel. Then we've got design tokens, which are the most basic foundational pieces of a design system. They're like tiny pieces of UI information, like colors, object shadows, border radius, amongst many others. If you're familiar with atomic design, tokens would be even smaller than atoms. In fact, they define atoms. Tokens can be found on the style guide, and they're used to define all components. Then we've got a UI kit, which is a collection of the individual and reusable pieces of the interface of a digital product. UI kits live in design tools like Figma or Sketch, and they speed our workflow as designers by not having to design from scratch every single time. Then we have the component library, which is basically the code equivalent of a UI kit. A component library would have code snippets for each of the components in the UI kit. And if we understand components as individual puzzle pieces, patterns are best practices for combining those components for specific user-focused tasks and page types. We collect them, well, in the pattern library. Up next, we've got design principles. So principles are a set of considerations that guide decision-making. They can be used by organizations, product teams, and individuals, and they affect component creation, governance, and maintenance. Then we've got guidelines that are like instructions for the users of the design system. Each component and pattern will have documentation that ensures everyone knows how and when it should be used. We then collect all of these elements into a reference site, which is simply a website where different teams go to get what they need from the design system. Some teams use third-party tools to build their reference sites, while others choose to build their own. So all these things come together to make a design system that will inform one or multiple digital products. And Ala Komatova defines design systems very well in her book, Design Systems. She says, a design system is a set of connected patterns and shared practices coherently organized to serve the purposes of a digital product. Cool. So now that we've untangled and clarified what elements make a design system and how they relate, I want to share with you an 8-step guide on building a robust design system foundation. So first, you're going to want to identify and understand your starting point. You need to know where you're at to know where you're going. And as a designer, it's very tempting to, well, just get designing. It definitely is the most enjoyable part for me, but we must resist our urge to create until we understand. This will allow us to create design systems tuned to the organizations they serve. You need to understand the team and how they work, identify and analyze what tools they use, what their pain points are, what works and doesn't work in their current design process, and ultimately assess the digital design maturity of the team. And when I've worked with organizations, you often get bombarded with information and resources from different teams. However, analyzing the team's outputs pales in comparison to talking to the people creating and managing those outputs. So, how can you approach this first stage of talking to people? You can run group sessions with different stakeholders, but bear in mind that sometimes people might be less keen to open up about what doesn't work in a group setting. So do consider running one-on-one interviews. When you prepare the interview script, make sure you have a clear idea of what you're trying to get from the interviewees and tailor your line of questioning to help the type of role you'll be talking to. And if you talk to people from the beginning, you will foster a sense of empathy, making stakeholders feel understood and letting them know you actually care about their pain points. This will promote design system co-ownership, which is an essential aspect of scalability. And being an external studio that comes into these organizations, I have observed that people are usually quite open and willing to talk since we're objective and we're not involved in internal politics. Okay, so the second thing you want to do is have a clear picture of the value you'll be creating. In this step, we must define and be clear on the value proposition of our design system to get buy-in for it. Although outlining the proven benefits of a design system might not be enough to get buy-in, being aware of them is the first step in the buy-in road. So let's run through the ways design systems create value for different stakeholders. So design systems serve customers by reducing the learning curve for how things work in each product, by providing a unified and consistent experience across products, avoiding confusion and aiding usability, and finally, by creating a faster experience, since fewer and more consistent components will mean cleaner code, resulting in better performance. They also serve product teams by increasing design and development speed, by making room for the team to solve more complex problems, and by providing a shared language and source of truth to cross-functional teams. And finally, they also serve the organization by keeping costs down through reusing components and therefore functionality, by improving brand loyalty, by helping with the scalability of products, and finally, by creating more robust and more unified product teams. And despite the known benefits of design systems, it always seems a bit of an uphill battle to get buy-in to create one. So I want to share with you a couple key things that have helped us to get buy-in as an external agency. So the first is to match the benefits of a design system to organization-specific problems and goals. You need to explain how the design system will solve the current problems your organization is specifically facing and the value that those solutions will generate. In the previous step of this guide, we just touched on the importance of talking to people. This again will be key when defining those problems. The second is to join and lead change already in the works. If an organization has already committed to significant company-wide changes, such as rebranding, you can use this to create momentum for a design system effort. And the third is to help with the functional work needed for that change. This means helping leadership with a roadmap by designing the next thing that adds customer value. The worst thing we can do is start designing random components to put designs together, because components and patterns result from designing products, not the other way around. So by helping design what adds and maximizes that customer value, you're improving the product you're designing, as well as the design system. Okay, so up next, you're gonna want to find your team. So the team structure for a design systems team will depend on the design system stage. The number of people involved will grow as the design system matures. But at the very early stages of creating a design system, at a minimum, the team usually consists of a UX designer, a UI designer, and a front-end developer. As the system grows, other roles will need to be involved, such as accessibility experts, content strategists, UX researchers, amongst others. And when choosing people to collaborate with, what has helped me quite a bit is kind of finding people who are excited about making the best product possible and finding people who think things could be done a bit better. Usually, there are already people working on improving things, and the goal is basically to get us all working together. You will likely uncover who these people are talking to stakeholders, as we talked about in the first step of the guide. They will be your allies throughout the process. So the next thing you want to think about is defining purpose through design principles. So principles are value statements tied to the goals of the product. They guide the team every step of the way by defining what makes a good design system, in what way is it good, and how we might measure its goodness. Design principles align the whole team around a shared purpose and way of doing things. This step is actually quite often overlooked. And looking back at my own experiences creating the foundation of design systems, I wish I had invested more time in it and involved people more collaboratively, because it does impact immediate and future work. If you don't have a set of principles in place, you risk making inconsistent design decisions, and there will be no guidance as to when it is and isn't acceptable to break the rules. This will make trade-off decisions quite difficult, and the outcomes of those decisions might end up being based on personal preference alone. If I were to approach the creation of principles today, I would involve multiple roles in a workshop and create them together, because running a workshop would promote design system co-ownership and make it more likely for these principles to be accepted and stuck to by the whole team. In this session, my main goal would be to define what we advocate for and why, and align everyone on what a great design system means for its users. So, after you have a clear idea of your principles, you'll be ready to start looking at things a little bit less abstractly. So, the next step will depend on whether you're working with an existing product or not. If you're creating a design system for a completely new product, you can skip the next step, which is conducting a UI audit. So a UI audit is a task that takes stock of all the different styles, components, and patterns used by our product or products. A UI audit has two main goals. Number one, identifying major areas of inconsistency, and number two, identifying reusability potential. This means knowing which components are most commonly used across the interface. This task will also help reinforce the design system's value proposition, as it will visually flesh out all the different points of fragmentation in the interface. And a UI audit can be done by one person, or it can be done as a team exercise, as long as the people contributing have a good eye for visual design. So you can give each team member one part of the interface, for example, one page per person, and get them to catalog the styles and components they see. The goal is not to catalog every component's instance, but every variation of that component. Meaning, we don't want 20 screenshots of the same call to action button. We want screenshots of instances where that same call to action button is using a slightly different font size, different shadow, or any other stylistic attribute variations. And when approaching the UI audit, I'd recommend you start with the most foundational elements, such as color, and work your way up to components and patterns using a modular approach to categorize everything. And When I've conducted UI audits, I've usually used Trello, which works quite well as it's pretty collaborative. Great. So up next, your team will want to have a centralized design workflow when you get designing. This has played a vital role in managing inputs from multiple designers and developers when starting design systems. At Fruto, when we've worked with large teams, we've used Abstract in combination with Sketch and Zeppelin. Abstract allows us to have complete version control, making really easy to track changes. However, I would recommend Figma for projects with a smaller team of collaborators or for better live collaboration and performance, because sometimes Sketch can be quite slow. So once you have a place to call the source of truth for your design team, you can start to design the product and systemize foundations. So when it comes to designing, you might have decided to create a new visual language or improve the one you're currently using. Regardless of which approach you take, the first thing you need to do is start designing the product. As you design the different pages and templates, you will start abstracting components that serve multiple use cases for that product, instead of creating a component to use elsewhere before you even know it will be needed. There will be components with high reusability and that are therefore more obvious components, such as buttons, but others will only become obvious once you've identified the need they solve multiple times throughout the interface. The idea is to create a pattern library with components and patterns that are actually reusable. We want to avoid ending up with a bunch of one-off components that have no actual use case. And the way you organize these components will depend on each project. But using Brad Frost's atomic design approach is a great way to approach the categorization. And rules for things like color, spacing, typography, layout, visual form, meaning shadows, texture, corner styling, etc., will emerge once we start designing the product and will be systemized once we have some key pages designed and we know how we're using them. Systemizing these core visual language elements is key to creating a robust design system foundation. The ones that play the most significant role in your interface are color, typography, and spacing. So when it comes to color, if you're working on an existing product, look back at your UI audit exercise and ask and answer these questions. 1, is there a clear rule for how each color is being used? 2, is this color variant intentional or is it random? And 3, which colors can we bin and what are we replacing them with? These questions will help you remove unintentional inconsistencies and better understand how color is being used in the product. You will also need to look at your organization's brand color palette. I have often had to design experiences with branding that has been handed over to me and primarily based on print, which unfortunately rarely translates into digital. If this is the case for your project, I suggest you spend a little bit extra time adapting that palette to digital purposes. Generally, when we think of a color palette in design, we think of a branded color palette. And although this color palette is key to defining the interface, we need a bit more flexibility in UI design because color plays a way more extensive role in UI. It conveys hierarchy and feedback, it guides users through the interface, and it plays a crucial role in accessibility. When you think of the palette, ensure that you can use at least one of the primary brand colors for interactive elements such as buttons and links. If the color doesn't work because it fails accessibility, you can propose tweaking it slightly so that it does pass. And the easiest way to get an accessible color is just by decreasing the light value. You will also need an array of neutrals. Usually there's some sort of gray. And elements such as forms, functional icons, cards, shadows, and text usually use these colors. Finally, you'll need system colors. These will be used in error, success, and warning states. I also wanted to talk a little bit about naming conventions, as they will play a key role in systemizing color in your design system. So we've looked at our base color palette, which is formed by primary colors, maybe secondary and even tertiary ones, neutrals, and system colors. However, your colors will need to account for more than one variation to ensure flexibility and things, for example, like hover states. So you will need tints and shades. For these types of variations, I'd suggest you introduce numbers into your naming conventions in the following way. For example, the base or default color can use the number 500. And then for lighter variations of that color, you can use 400, 300, 200, and so on. And for darker ones, you use larger numbers like 600, 700, and so on. In this way, you'll end up with the following naming structure: the color name / the variant. So for example, primary green 500, success 200, error 800, and so on. When it comes to systemizing typography, the key is to keep it simple and ensure adaptability between screen sizes. Usually, you only need 1 or 2 typefaces, unless you're creating a system for multiple products with different brands, in which case you'll of course need more. I think it's important to note that different website archetypes will have different needs for type scales. Generally speaking, there are 3 types of website archetypes when it comes to typography. A marketing site, which the primary purpose is to tell a story. These sites usually need larger title sizes and more contrast between sizes. Then we've got blog sites, like for example, Medium. Their primary purpose is to convey large amounts of text-based information. And then we've got product sites, which their primary purpose is to solve a user problem. There's less contrast between text sizes, and these types of sites often don't need huge titles. So when creating your type scale, choose a base size. This will dictate all font sizes upwards and downwards from that value. A good rule of thumb is using 16 pixels as your base size, as it works with the 4 base metrics. I will explain the 4 base metrics in a bit more detail when we jump into systemizing spacing. I recommend using a modular scale to create larger and smaller font sizes. The scale works by having a base number, 16, and a ratio that generates the next value. So you apply the chosen ratio to the following number to get the next one, and so on. The larger the ratio, the more contrast between sizes and the larger the fonts get from the base upwards. You want to consider this when choosing the ratio depending on the type archetype you're creating. And I recommend using typescale.com to create a modular scale. It works really well. And when it comes to making your type scale responsive, there is no one size fits all. The way you systemize your type scale for responsiveness will depend on the project. However, a rule of thumb that's often worked for me when adapting desktop font sizes to smaller displays is grabbing the desktop H2 title font size and using it for the H1 on smaller displays. In the same way, you'd use the desktop H3 title to define the H2 for smaller displays, and so on. So when it comes to spacing plays a huge role in any interface. It's mainly responsible for the rhythm and balance of your pages. I have found the best way to systemize spacing is to make it predictable. And the way you can do this is by using the 4 base scale. This means using multiples of 4 for sizing and spacing elements both horizontally and vertically. The 4 base scale will ensure easy and consistent scalability across a wide range of devices. And spacing can become quite tricky when you throw in font line height into the mix. But a quick and easy way to ensure the line height doesn't throw off the 4 base scale completely is to ensure that the line height for any text style is also a multiple of 4. When you create a spacing scale, smaller values will start pretty close to each other, and they will get progressively more spaced apart at the larger end of the scale. This is because differences between values are much more noticeable when they are small than when they are large. And when it comes to naming conventions for spacings, T-shirt sizes actually work pretty well, as they allow the team to refer back to each spacing type and remember them easily. For example, you can have a base spacing and call it spacing medium, and any spacing smaller than that can be called spacing small, spacing extra small, and so on. When it comes to responsiveness, a rule of thumb I've often used to adapt larger screen spacing to smaller screens is reducing each of the desktop spacing values by 8 pixels from the base unit upwards, the base unit being 16 pixels. The NHS, for example, they use this approach for their spacing scale to make it responsive. And once you've created designs, you can go one step further and create perhaps more detailed spacing rules for specific components if you need it. And the last step in our guide is that there is no last step. So I want to tell you a story that I think perfectly illustrates the approach we should take to scaling and maintaining design systems. You might have heard it before. So in Honduras, hurricanes are not a rare thing. And in 1998, they built this bridge that connected two pieces of land divided by the Choluteca River. Some fantastic architects and engineers designed a bridge capable of withstanding very adverse weather conditions. In the same year, Hurricane Mitch, one of the strongest hurricanes seen in the region, swept through Honduras, causing significant damage. However, the Choluteca Bridge survived it with barely a scratch. To everyone's surprise, however, the bridge wasn't bridging anything anymore. The storm and heavy rains had changed the course of the river altogether. This goes to say that a design system is never finished. Unlike pieces of architecture, we can't design it and leave it because we risk it being rendered useless, like the bridge in this example. A design system requires constant maintenance. It should be built to adapt rather than last. And for a design system to succeed, everyone should be invited to improve it and feel a sense of ownership over it. The system needs to be flexible and serve the teams that use it rather than become a constraint. So just really quickly to recap the steps in our guide. The first thing is identifying your starting point. Second is have a clear picture of the value you'll be creating, find your team, define purpose through design principles, conduct a UI audit, create a centralized design workflow, design the product and systemize foundations, and lastly, you're just never finished. And I'd like to know, what do you think is the most important aspect to keep in mind when building a robust design system foundation? Thank you very much for listening.